Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershistory, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that following the Revolutionary War, some women activists were beginning to make very public, but not quite convincing arguments for legal and social equality and the right to vote? And that the Articles of Confederation weren't a total failure. They helped determine the settlement and the admission process for a lot of Western lands, which became pretty important. And the Annapolis Convention in 1786, which I spoke about briefly last week, actually was gathered specifically to talk about trade between the states, but then evolved into a much larger discussion. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will cover that and more in episode 75, The Birth of a Republican Nation. Sort of. Hello everyone, welcome into episode 75. I'm looking forward to continuing our discussion on the sort of interregnum period between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. And today we're going to more or less break our lesson up into three parts. Number one is I want to go back and look at how the war affected certain groups of people like women, Native Americans, and slaves during this time, just sort of at a very high level. And then we'll move on to talk a bit about the one major success of the Articles of Confederation before wrapping the episode up today, going into a bit more detail on the Annapolis Convention of 1786. So last week we went into detail about Shays's rebellion and the impact that it had both locally and nationally at the time. The rebellion exposed the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and drove some to demand serious reforms to their current government with such a severely limited domestic scope. Toward the end of the episode, we then covered the subsequent actions of the Gathering of Representatives in Annapolis, the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and I even mentioned briefly the Whiskey Rebellion. Well, today we're going to pause the narrative a bit and dive deeper into what the social challenges were following the war, like I mentioned, and then move on to talk a little bit more about the Articles of Confederation and the Annapolis Convention. So following the war, the notion of Republican government began to take hold throughout the states. Although we know about the Articles of Confederation being the first national Republican government, the states continued the momentum that began during the war and advocated for their own state Republican governments. During the war, states like Rhode Island and Connecticut had changed language in their state constitutions to remove any reference to the king, but that certainly wasn't the extent of it. While removing any sign of monarchy from their constitutions was a first step, republicanism meant far more than anti-monarchy. The Declaration of Independence spoke about the government deriving its power from the consent of the governed, and some states found that their representatives were less wealthy and more common than prior to the outbreak of the war. This democratic undertone to the war effort further emboldened these young Americans to push new horizons, while also simultaneously posing a direct challenge to the ideas of a newer, more powerful, and sustainable central government. A perfect example of this democratic upheaval was in Pennsylvania. In 1776, the Penn family was booted from power. Property ownership was no longer needed in order to vote or to hold office. And in their convention, they created a unicameral legislature with no governor. While this progressive movement toward a more democratic government was possible for many, there were other more conservative patriots, men like the Adams cousins, who weren't so inclined to see things stretch quite this far. John Adams stated that a purely democratic Congress, such as the one established in Pennsylvania, could lead to the oppression of majority rule, stating that, quote, "If you give ordinary citizens command or preponderance in the legislature, they will vote all property out of the hands of you aristocrats." And, well, for Sam Adams, we saw what Sam thought of some of these ideas last week in his reaction to Shays' Rebellion. As a counterpoint, John Adams had offered his Thoughts on Government, a pamphlet published in 1776 to detail why America should have a mixed government, similar to the one in England that shared the power between the king and two houses of parliament. John Adams also spoke about the importance of having separate branches of government, such as a legislature, a judiciary, and executive, with the legislature having, two houses, one appointed and one elected. The upper house would be more established property holders, and their votes could counter the more democratically elected and democratically representative lower house. This all starting to sound familiar to you? In response to this, states like New York, Massachusetts, and South Carolina agreed and kept their property requirements and even raised them in some cases. In the end, the outbreak of war had a bit of a mixed impact. You had some very progressive states like Pennsylvania and Vermont pushing the envelope, while others were maintaining a conservative twist to their new revolutionary perspective. In the end, though, in all the states, the representative legislature acquired more power, which in turn gave more power to the average citizen, who now, more than ever, felt like their voice was finally being heard. But let's not pretend like all citizens were able to directly enjoy the newly empowered legislature and the increased role of the people in government. Women, many of them from the upper class, found themselves filling pages of their diaries and letters with their take on the politics of the day, with others even engaging in political conversations and informal debates, much to the ire and frustration of many men at this time. Unsurprisingly, the men controlled pretty much all aspects of the government: elected officials, juries, judges, etc. In response to this reality, Eliza Wilkinson from South Carolina complained that, quote, "The men say we have no business with politics. They won't even allow us liberty of thought, and that is all I want." And while we know that true civil and political equality for women is the most fair and acceptable approach to civilized society, most women at this time weren't going that far in their demands. They recognized the political and social structures that were in place, and many knew it would be foolhardy to think that they could enact such radical change in such a short time. But not all women were content to sit back and allow their second-class citizenry to be the acceptable norm. Famously, Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, was incredibly outspoken about her desire for gender equality, particularly for married women. As the wife of John Adams and the person who ran the household and the property during the war, it continued to frustrate Abigail that she legally could not do things like own property, enter into contracts, or even hold the war bonds that she and her family had purchased. She had to give them to one of her male relatives to be looked upon. And don't think that John got off easy for this inconvenient reality. No, sir. Abigail derided him for working so hard toward freedom while more or less continuing to socially enslave the women, including her, his wife. Abigail shamed John for his attempt to, quote, "emancipate all nations from monarchical despotism," while retaining absolute power over women. But all of this work from various women was all for naught, at least in the short term. While some men were sympathetic to their wishes and others even agreed with them, social conventions were too strong. And the federal government that was formed did not give women the opportunity to vote and participate in government. Only the men. And while this seems a bit ridiculous given its inherent stupidity, at least from my perspective, some women reasoned as to why this might be the case. In her 1779 essay on the equality of sexes, Judith Murray reasoned that most women at the time were not as prepared and capable when it came to politics and societal responsibility outside of the home. But that was from lack of training, not lack of ability or lack of intelligence. Murray stated that, quote, "We can only reason from what we know, and most women have been denied the opportunity for acquiring knowledge." While nothing immediate happened in the late 18th century with regards to women's rights, the conversation at least had begun. As women did begin to explore education and formal training and life outside the home more often, society slowly began to see clear evidence of their capabilities. By the mid-19th century, the literacy rates for men and women were equal, and conversations about gender equality began to spring up again prior to the Civil War, only once again to be drowned out by a seemingly more urgent political question: what to do about slavery. Speaking of slavery and the enslaved African Americans in this new country, they're one of the three groups I'd like to speak briefly about, and the impact that the war had on them too, with the other two groups being loyalists and the natives. But let's begin with the loyalists. The war had a pretty simple impact on many of them. After the conflict was officially over, they were no longer welcome. As many as 100,000 loyalists fled the United States of America, leaving their land and some of their possessions behind. A majority of these men and women suffered financial loss during the war, some of it pretty severe, and you can imagine how critically their social and political capital was impacted following the Patriot victory. So the next question became, what do we do with all of their property? Like their, awesome land that they left behind. Well, those who advocated a democratic solution often proffered the solution to this problem by saying, seize the property and distribute it to the citizenry. That's fair, right? But of course, many politicians who were often directly or indirectly influenced by local business leaders weren't quite willing to be that progressively populist. Instead, the land was usually auctioned off, and as you can likely imagine, the poor farmers were rarely the men who were able to take advantage of this opportunity. Instead, the land usually went to the wealthier coastal merchants who became the new American business elite, supplanting the old guard at the top of the economic and political food chain. The good thing that came out of this? Well, these men, these patriot business leaders and merchants, were usually more forward-thinking and American-centric. So instead of reinvesting the trade profits into just like a lot more land, like the old loyalist merchants did, they provided for more domestic manufacturing and exploring new opportunities in trade. They pushed for these things. And this type of forward thinking created a more self-sufficient economy that would benefit America for years to come. But the war wasn't just supposedly good for these coastal merchants. In the last couple episodes, we detailed the hardships of the Western farmer, especially in New England. And those things were, those were really true. People experienced that. But there were others in the West who were still hopeful that this new government would be more supportive of their desires to move and settle west, considering Britain drew a line forbidding them to do so and then basically ignored them. It likely wouldn't be too difficult for the new government to be more open and supportive than that, right? The problem with this hope and this desire to move west so quickly was that people were already living there. Native Americans had claim to these lands, so the question then became, how is the government going to handle that seemingly inevitable conflict? And look, many of the people who wanted land in the West genuinely wanted to move out there to start a new life for themselves. But there was another group too. Others saw financial opportunity. These are called like land speculators, and I'll be referring to them more and more as we move through the 19th century. What is a land speculator? Well, that's someone who wants to buy the land thinking they can then sell it for more down the road. So they want to buy as much as they could and then bet on themselves that they'd be able to flip it for a sweet profit. Sort of like when you see these real estate house flipping shows on HGTV or whatever. They're basically like real estate speculators. They're betting that what they buy, they'll be able to turn into something nicer and then sell it for a profit. And of course, as you may or may not know, that can come with considerable risk. But if you get good at it, especially in the late 18th century with land, you can make a lot of money. And this was becoming like a new hot business at the time. George Washington lamented that people were throwing around ideas of laying claim to 500,000 acres, right? Like 500,000 after the war, almost as often as they used to speak about buying up 1,000 acres prior to the war. So this was becoming a very popular profession. But in all, Americans thought that the victory did, in some ways, give them a blank check to determine their own future on this vast continent, and they were going to take advantage of these opportunities even if the natives stood physically or conceptually in their way. Lastly, and the most painful and obvious form of hypocrisy following the Revolutionary War came in the form of handling African American slaves. Like the Native American obstacle in the West, many Southerners believed that they had fought in this war to secure their right to own their property, not the other way around. Conversation about emancipation, and emancipation is the freeing of slaves, did begin to gain momentum during the war and continued after, but Southern slave owners fought back indignantly against such notions. These slaveholders relied on the principles of the revolution itself to defend their stances, arguing that they risked everything in the war, sometimes their own lives and the lives of loved ones, in order to secure the property rights, and they would be damned if the new government decided to almost immediately flip the script and take that from them. It was becoming more and more clear to many that while the idea of slavery and freedom were an undeniable paradox, and for some of the Founding Fathers an incredibly shameful one, creating one nation united under common goals and a shared mission was, at least in some of their minds, going to be next to impossible if this issue of emancipation was stubbornly put forth. And this same paradox also was true when talking about Western lands and Native Americans too. We've talked at length about the failures of the Articles of Confederation, but I would be remiss if I didn't take at least a few moments and acknowledge some of the diplomatic success of the Articles before we move on from it completely in this historical narrative. Following the war, as I alluded to earlier, there were thousands of men and women who were pushing west and wanting to settle in these new lands, in addition to others who had their eyes on Western lands for business purposes, these land speculators. Heck, by 1784, more than 30,000 people had already moved into present-day Tennessee and Kentucky, and by the end of the war, even more people set their eyes on Western lands. In fact, some of the people that moved to these areas petitioned the Congress to create a new state called Franklin. But the Congress, not wanting to so quickly give up their control over the land, logically refused. Instead, they created the Southwest Territory and the Mississippi Territory. One thing that's important to note about these territories, and this is a big deal, is that this land came from land claim cessions of the states of Georgia and North Carolina. If you remember, like Maryland was the last holdout and Virginia was second to last holdout. Basically the idea that all the extra land beyond the current state borders would be handed over to the federal government. We covered that in a previous episode. Well, when these two states, Georgia and North Carolina, agreed to give up their land claims to the government, they did it under a condition. And that condition was that this new land could not pass laws emancipating slaves. This then ensured that the new states formed in this land, which will be Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi, would have to allow slavery and human bondage. Because of this, we can see that Many of the slaveholders in the South were already thinking about the expansion of their businesses west and also wary of the future prospects of slavery if they didn't continue to expand slave power. As we will see moving forward in this podcast, the idea that the only way to maintain the power to own slaves was to keep expanding the reach of slavery. And this was a common idea and it goes all the way through into the first half of the 19th century and continued to create tension between the North and the South that inevitably led to the Civil War. But slavery was in fact banned north of the Ohio River, a land that was nicknamed the Old Northwest. This land includes present-day states such as Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota. Between 1784 and 1787, the Confederation Congress was able to pass 3 different pieces of legislation that determined what would happen to this land. The important things to know about this legislation are as follows. Number 1, the territories could apply for statehood once they reached a certain population. Number 2, a rectangular grid system would be put into place in order to ensure the proper buying and selling of acreage. And finally, and most importantly, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 officially created the territories of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, prohibited slavery from these lands, appointed governors for the land, and left open the opportunity that these territories could then elect their own legislature. In the end, these land ordinances were one of the few things the Articles of Confederation got right. They allowed for an orderly and organized settlement of this new land, ensured that slavery could not be in these areas, and gave people an idea of how this new western land would be governed. On the flip side, though, if you want to state the counter-argument, allowing lands in the South to be pro-slavery and lands north of the Ohio to be free began the practice of literally dividing the nation on specific borders and landmarks, ensuring that the division of the country between North and South would only continue as far west as settlers continued to travel. Not only this, but sort of unforgivably, it also just ignored the native claims to these lands, wholly acting like they weren't even there in the first place. This is something we'll get more into in a future episode, but worth being cognizant of here. Now that we've touched on the social impacts of the war and how it affected certain groups at, a high level and detailed the success of the Articles of Confederation, let's circle back to the end of last week's episode and briefly discuss the Annapolis Convention. If you recall, there was a significant cadre of Federalist-leaning politicians in the United States at this time, men who were determined to fight for a more powerful and impactful federal government. We've spoken about how Shays' rebellion gave these men an event to point to and even created more widespread support for their cause. But even before the effects of Shays' rebellion had rippled throughout the states, a few of the more proactive members of the Federalist group were already fed up with the inefficiencies of the Articles and ready to do something about it. The meeting of these minds, colloquially known as the Annapolis Convention, but also referred to as the Meeting of Commissioners to Remedy Defects of the Federal Government, was held in September of 1786 in Annapolis, Maryland, the current state capital of Maryland, home of the Naval Academy, and one of my favorite cities in the country. Delegates from 5 states, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Virginia, met at Mann's Tavern, which, side note, no longer exists, just a plate now that says where it used to be, sort of a bummer. But anyway, they met there to discuss the weaknesses of the article. Specifically, and this is what most people don't realize, they met specifically to discuss trade barriers. See, each state under the current system in 1786 could more or less create their own trade barriers and stipulations for trade, taxes, and things of that sort, which made things incredibly overly complicated and severely hampered such an enormous opportunity for effective interstate trade that was born from the victory in the war. Since the federal government had no authority to regulate trade, there was really nothing they could do about it. These delegates not only were frustrated about this, but also viewed these constraints as a huge missed opportunity for this young country. Now, 4 of these 5 states were really only authorized to discuss these trade regulations, but New Jersey was given authorization to talk about other issues too. But to be honest with you, they didn't even have to get into these broader issues, because what they began to realize was that the issues with trade were all interconnected to broader weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation that they felt needed to be dealt with. Heading into the convention, Alexander Hamilton was totally on board with sweeping changes to the Articles, including writing an entirely new document. But his fellow colleague, and someone whose name you also might recognize, Mr. James Madison from Virginia, was still hoping they'd be able to make small, piecemeal changes to the Articles that would lead to the result that he desired. As the convention progressed, though, it was becoming more and more obvious to the members, and Madison specifically, that more sweeping changes were needed. And since they couldn't even gather a quorum in the first place, Madison began to fall more in line with Hamilton, and the men then sent an official request to the Confederation Congress that another convention be scheduled for the following year, this time in Philadelphia. As the convention adjourned and each member went their own way, they knew that they had their work cut out for them to drum up support for another, hopefully better attended convention the following year. As we have discussed, though, Shays' rebellion and other protests throughout the state seemed to do their job for them, lighting a fire under many politicians and convincing them that changes needed to be made, and someone needed to be present for their state to advocate on its behalf in Philadelphia. Next week, we'll continue with this narrative and get one step closer to our new and current form of government. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.